Cuba's incredible informal economy. When it comes to Cuba, people often think of its beautiful beaches, unique cigars, and classic cars. But many people don't realize it actually has a bustling black market that involves everything from drug smuggling to something as mundane as selling newspapers. In order to understand why Cuba's economy is what it is today, it's also important to consider its history. Until 1898, Cuba was primarily under Spain's control for a few hundred years. Then, during the Spanish-American War, the United States defeated Spain and gained control of Cuba. However, 4 years later, in 1902, Cuba became partially independent from the US. Although Cuba could form its own government, the US could decide its foreign policy and had the right to intervene in its internal affairs. Following a few decades of American interventions, in 1933, an uprising against the Cuban government was led by Fulgencio Batista. Over the next 20 years, Cuba became a democracy, maintaining a friendly relationship with the US, and the US no longer had the right to intervene in its internal affairs. In 1944, 11 years after Batista came to power, Batista retired. However, 8 years after his apparent retirement, in 1952, Batista seized power again and now ruled with a corrupt and repressive regime. The next year, in 1953, a then young Fidel Castro led Cuba's communist uprising. However, the United States, fearing the spread of communism, backed Batista with military aid no matter how brutal he became. When finally in 1959 the US withdrew aid to Batista, Fidel Castro led a guerrilla army into Havana, the capital of Cuba, and made himself prime minister. In the following year, all US businesses in Cuba were nationalized, and Washington severed all diplomatic ties with Havana. During the years after that, the United States was still fearing the expansion of communism, so they set up a trade embargo on exports to Cuba. Relations between the US and Castro grew more hostile, and several assassination plots also took place. So instead, Castro sought help from the USSR, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This tense, but mostly uneventful period, continued through to the 1990s. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, both President Clinton and Fidel Castro sought to end the conflict, but relationships worsened. In 1993, the US tightened its embargo in the hope that it would lead to the deterioration of Cuba's economy, and in 1996, the embargo was made permanent. This situation again continued for the next decade, when in 2008, Fidel Castro's brother, Raúl, took over as president. And in 2014, after secret talks by President Obama and Raúl Castro, an agreement to end the conflict was reached. From 2014 to now, trade restrictions between the US and Cuba have been eased, and relations between Cuba and the rest of the world have been steadily improving. This all results in a modern Cuba, which has a centrally planned economy that's dominated by state-owned enterprises. In 2000, public sector employment was 76%. In 2011, Raúl's government introduced major economic reforms. These included legalizing the sale and private ownership of homes and cars, legalizing 201 different personal business licenses, creating incentives for non-state employment, and restructuring the tax policy. These reforms created a system which is now referred to as the new Cuban economy. However, despite these major changes, Cuba still maintains nationalized firms that manage the distribution of all essential services and goods, such as electricity, water, education, and healthcare. The government still sets the majority of prices, and investment is limited and needs to be approved. Thus, out of necessity, a black market for almost every good was born. Whereas underground markets in other countries only exist for the trade of illegal and dangerous goods and services such as drugs or prostitution, Cuba's underground economy comprises of many goods and services that would be legal if they were officially licensed by the government. However, the government only licensed a very small fraction of applicants, and, once authorized, small businesses still faced heavy taxation and an intensely regulated market. Thus, there is no surprise that a large underground economy exists in Cuba. Some surprising consequences of the Cuban economy is that taxi drivers earn more than highly skilled workers such as engineers or doctors. This is due to the fact that the state sets prices for most jobs. The average monthly salary of a Cuban is $25 per month according to Cuba's National Office of Statistics. However, as driving taxis are one of the few jobs that can have private licenses, they can charge people whatever they want. So, by charging tourists high prices, in 1 hour they can make more than the average monthly salary. This has led to the phenomenon where highly skilled workers are leaving their jobs to do menial work such as being a taxi driver or running a barbershop. However, the majority of Cubans are still employed by the state, and as $25 is too little to survive off of, almost every Cuban has a secondary source of income from the black market. Elderly men buy newspapers in the morning and sell them for a profit. Bartenders replace rum with their own homemade liquor and sell the leftovers. The black market exists just to allow people to survive. One very interesting aspect of the underground market is the trade of digital media. Technology is still fairly new to Cuba, with the sales of mobile phones and personal computers only being legalized in 2008. Until then, only government officials had access to them. Under Fidel Castro's rule, anyone who spoke out against the government was punished, and there was no freedom of expression. The advent of the internet, which was decentralized and difficult to control, would clearly be a challenge, so the government limited internet access. Since Raul's ascension to power, there have been several attempts by the US and even Google to offer to help build the infrastructure necessary to provide more extensive access to the internet, but the government has refused to cooperate. Now, citizens can access Wi-Fi at government-run cybercafes, or at one of the new 200 Wi-Fi hotspots spread across the country. It costs $2 to buy an access card, and with that card, one can gain access to Wi-Fi at one of the hotspots for 1 hour. This scheme started in 2015 and proved to be incredibly popular. However, ordinary Cubans still aren't satisfied due to the high costs, limited bandwidth, and the fact that internet access is still illegal in private homes. As the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. So one illegal creation that's popular in Cuba is StreetNet. This is essentially created by wirelessly connecting home computers together in one giant mesh network with no central server. StreetNet, or SNet for short, provides services such as social networking, chatting services, file transfer, blogs, and forums, which previously Cubans could not access at home. SNET comprises of over 10,000 users, and it's still growing. It's a unique underground market in the sense that it's free, non-commercial, and self-sufficient. However, there have also been other attempts at solutions to Cuba's internet problem. Much like drug dealers, there exist dealers in Cuba who have the latest media from around the world and distribute them for a price. This is called el paquete semanal, or the weekly package. Essentially, there is one main center where the latest TV shows, movies, music, cartoons, and mobile apps from around the world are gathered. Then, once these are collected, these are copied to hard drives that will be distributed across the capital and even the country. Then local dealers with the hard drives sell flash drives with the new content to locals every week for approximately $2. Not only does this create jobs in the underground economy, but also it gives Cubans access to media from around the world that previously they had no way of accessing. Due to its clandestine nature, there is no way of knowing exactly how many paquete consumers there are, but it is thought to be the largest media distribution company in Cuba. One might wonder how such widespread activities such as the paquete and SNET continue to operate undetected by the government. However, what is more likely is the case that the government recognizes this and many other underground activities, but turn a blind eye to this to avoid backlash. It's important to note that in both the paquete and SNET, there is a strict rule on not distributing controversial or pornographic content, or anything with anti-government material in it. Thus, in this way, the government will have no real motive to intervene and stop these activities. Therefore, it's evident that Cuba has one of the most intricate underground economies in the world, encompassing everything from electronics to clothes. There is no doubt that in the current political climate, unless something changes, there will continue to be a flourishing black market. Although the state of Cuba's economy is improving, it's improving slowly. Despite the major economic reforms, the major hurdle of change is the ongoing US trade embargo. Its initial goal was to put pressure on the Cuban government and create resistance that would overthrow it. But now that friendly relations between the two countries have been restored, many don't see the reason why it still exists. The United Nations General Assembly hold a vote on a resolution calling for the embargo to end every year. Last year, 191 countries voted in favour, and for the first time, instead of voting against it, the US abstained on the vote, showing that there is hope that the embargo will end soon. With the death of Fidel Castro last year, and further improved relations between Cuba and the rest of the world, all we can do is wait and see what the future will hold for Cuba's economy.